The morning mist clung to the ancient stones of Windsor Castle as Sergeant Thomas Mitchell adjusted his red tunic for what would be the last time. He had served the crown for 12 years, standing guard through rain and shine, protecting the royal family with unwavering dedication. His polished boots clicked against the cobblestones as he made his way to his post, unaware that this day would shatter everything he believed about duty and honor. Thomas had always been different from the other guards. Where others saw their role as ceremonial, he understood it as sacred. His grandfather had served King George VI, and his father had protected Queen Elizabeth II during her early years. The Mitchell family had royal protection running through their veins like ancient blood. Thomas wore his uniform not just as clothing, but as a symbol of generations of loyal service. The castle bustled with its usual morning activities. Servants hurried through corridors carrying silver trays, gardeners tended to the pristine lawns, and tourists gathered outside the gates hoping for a glimpse of royalty. Thomas took his position at the main entrance, his trained eyes scanning every face that approached. He knew the routines, the protocols, and the faces of every person who had legitimate business within these walls. King Charles III had been on the throne for over 2 years now, but Thomas still remembered the uncertainty that had filled the castle during the transition period. The new king brought different energy, different expectations, and sometimes different rules that the old guard struggled to understand. Thomas had adapted, as he always did, because adaptation was survival in the royal service. On this particular Tuesday morning, something felt different. Thomas noticed unusual activity in the administrative wings of the castle. Men in expensive suits had been arriving since dawn, carrying briefcases and speaking in hushed tones. These were not the usual courtiers or government officials who frequented the castle. Their faces were unfamiliar, their manner urgent, and their presence made Thomas's instincts prickle with unease. The first sign of trouble came when Captain Reynolds, the head of palace security, approached Thomas's post. Reynolds was a man who had earned respect through 3 decades of flawless service, and his weathered face carried the weight of countless secrets. Today, however, something in his expression made Thomas's stomach tighten with dread. "Sergeant Mitchell," Reynolds said, his voice carefully controlled. "His Majesty requests your immediate presence in the blue drawing room." Thomas felt his heart skip. In 12 years of service, he had never been summoned directly by the monarch. Guards received their instructions through the chain of command, and personal audiences were reserved for matters of extreme importance or extreme displeasure. He followed Reynolds through the familiar corridors, past portraits of monarchs who had ruled for centuries, their painted eyes seeming to judge him as he passed. The blue drawing room was one of the castle's most elegant spaces, decorated with priceless artwork and furniture that had witnessed centuries of royal conversations. King Charles stood with his back to the door, looking out at the gardens where peacocks strutted across manicured lawns. His posture was rigid, and when he turned to face Thomas, his expression was cold in a way that made the room feel arctic. "Sergeant Mitchell," the king began, his voice carrying the authority of centuries of royal bloodline. "Your service to the crown has been noted and, until recently, appreciated." Thomas stood at attention, his training preventing him from showing the confusion and growing fear that churned in his stomach. The word "recently" hung in the air like a blade waiting to fall. He had done nothing wrong, followed every protocol, maintained the highest standards of conduct that had made the Mitchell name respected within palace walls. However, the king continued, moving closer until Thomas could see the disappointment etched in the royal features. "It has come to my attention that your loyalty may not be as absolute as previously believed." The accusation hit Thomas like a physical blow. Loyalty was everything in his world. It was the foundation upon which his entire identity was built. He wanted to speak, to defend himself, to demand an explanation, but protocol demanded silence until given permission to respond. The seconds stretched into eternity as King Charles studied his face, looking for signs of guilt or deception. "Your Majesty," Thomas finally managed when given a slight nod of permission, "I have served the crown with complete devotion. My loyalty has never wavered, nor would it ever waver." The king's expression remained unchanged, as if he had expected exactly that response. He walked to an ornate desk and picked up a manila folder that seemed to contain Thomas's entire future. The weight of whatever information lay within those pages filled the room with suffocating tension. "3 days ago," the king said, opening the folder with deliberate slowness, "you were observed in conversation with Mr. James Whitman, a journalist from the Guardian newspaper. This conversation took place in a public house in the village, away from palace grounds, during your off-duty hours. Thomas felt the blood drain from his face. He remembered the encounter clearly now, though at the time it had seemed completely innocent. Whitman had approached him, claiming to be researching a piece about the dedication of palace staff. The conversation had been brief, lasting perhaps 10 minutes, and Thomas had said nothing that he believed compromised security or violated his oath of service. The conversation was innocent, Your Majesty, Thomas said, his voice steady despite the panic rising in his chest. I disclosed no sensitive information, violated no protocols. I spoke only in general terms about the honor of serving the crown. King Charles closed the folder with a sharp snap that seemed to echo through the grand room like a judge's gavel. His eyes, which Thomas had always seen as kind during previous brief encounters, now held the coldness of a monarch who believed himself betrayed by someone he had trusted with his very life. The content of the conversation is not the issue, Sergeant, the king said, his voice growing harder with each word. The issue is that you engaged in any conversation at all with a member of the press without authorization. You know the protocols regarding media contact. You know the consequences. Thomas did know the protocols, but in 12 years of service, no journalist had ever approached him personally. The rules seemed academic, theoretical, something that applied to others, but not to a loyal soldier who would never dream of compromising his position. Now those theoretical rules had become a trap that was closing around his career, his reputation, and his family's legacy of service. Furthermore, the king continued, seeming to grow larger and more imposing with each revelation. Our investigation has revealed that this was not your first contact with members of the press. There have been other incidents, other conversations, a pattern of behavior that suggests a concerning disregard for the security protocols that protect not just the crown, but the entire realm. The words hit Thomas like hammer blows. Other incidents? Other conversations? He searched his memory desperately, trying to understand what the king meant. There had been casual encounters, certainly. Living in a small village near the castle meant occasionally speaking with strangers, some of whom might work for newspapers or magazines. But he had never considered these brief exchanges as violations of his oath. Your Majesty, if there have been misunderstandings about casual encounters in my personal time, I can explain each incident. I have never intentionally compromised security or violated my oath of service. The crown and the royal family are more important to me than my own life. The king studied him for a long moment, and Thomas thought he saw a flicker of something that might have been regret or sadness cross the royal features. But when the king spoke again, his voice was final, carrying the weight of absolute authority that had ruled Britain for over 1,000 years. Sergeant Mitchell, your service is terminated, effective immediately. You will surrender your uniform, your credentials, and any palace property in your possession. You are banned from palace grounds permanently, and any attempt to contact members of the royal family or palace staff will be considered a security breach with appropriate legal consequences. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. Thomas felt as if the ground had opened beneath his feet, sending him plummeting into an abyss of disbelief and devastation. 12 years of perfect service, a family legacy spanning 3 generations, a life built around duty and honor, all of it destroyed in a matter of minutes by accusations that felt like shadows without substance. Your Majesty, Thomas said, his voice breaking despite his efforts to maintain military composure. Please allow me to explain, to provide context for these alleged incidents. My family has served the crown faithfully for generations. This position is not just my career, it is my identity, my purpose. King Charles turned back to the window, dismissing Thomas with the gesture as effectively as if he had spoken the words aloud. The interview was over, the decision final, the consequences absolute. Thomas stood in the elegant room that suddenly felt like a courtroom where he had been tried, convicted, and sentenced without ever understanding the full nature of his alleged crimes. Captain Reynolds appeared at his elbow, ready to escort him from the royal presence and begin the humiliating process of stripping away everything that had made Thomas who he was. As they walked through the corridors that had been his second home for over a decade, Thomas's mind raced with questions that had no answers and a growing sense that something about this entire situation was fundamentally wrong. The other guards they passed looked away, unable to meet his eyes. Word of his dismissal had already spread through the palace grapevine with the speed that only truly shocking news could achieve. These men who had been his brothers, who had shared jokes and concerns and the quiet camaraderie of shared duty, now treated him like a stranger, a security risk, someone who had fallen from grace so completely that association with him might contaminate their own standing. In the guard station that had been his sanctuary for 12 years, Thomas removed his red tunic with shaking hands. Each button seemed to carry the weight of memories, standing in the rain during state ceremonies, sharing quiet conversations with tourists fascinated by palace history, feeling the profound pride that came with protecting something larger than himself. The uniform had been armor against the ordinary world, transforming him into something noble and important. As he folded the tunic for the final time, Thomas noticed something that made his blood run cold. Hidden in the inner pocket was a small device he had never seen before, a recording device that clearly had not been placed there by him. His hands trembled as he held the foreign object, understanding for the first time that he had not simply been dismissed for poor judgment or protocol violations. He had been set up, deliberately and professionally, by someone who wanted him removed from his position for reasons he could not begin to understand. The revelation changed everything. This was not about journalism or security breaches or casual conversations with strangers. This was about something much larger, much more dangerous, and Thomas Mitchell, loyal soldier and protector of the crown, had become an obstacle that someone needed removed. As he left Windsor Castle for the final time, carrying only a small bag of personal belongings, Thomas knew that his real journey was just beginning. Someone had destroyed his life, and he was going to find out who and why, no matter what it cost him. The cottage that Thomas had called home for the past 5 years felt like a prison cell as he sat at his kitchen table, staring at the recording device that had destroyed his life. Outside, the village of Old Windsor continued its peaceful existence, unaware that one of its residents had just become the center of a conspiracy that reached into the heart of the British monarchy. The afternoon sun streamed through lace curtains his grandmother had made, illuminating dust motes that danced like the fragments of his shattered career. Thomas had always been methodical, a trait that had served him well in the military and as a royal guard. Now he applied that same systematic approach to understanding what had happened to him. He laid out everything he could remember about the past few weeks, looking for patterns, for moments when someone could have planted the device, for faces that had appeared more than once in his daily routine. The recording device was professional grade, expensive, and required technical knowledge to operate effectively. His phone buzzed with text messages from former colleagues, each one a knife twist of sympathy and curiosity. Some offered support. Others warned him that association with a dismissed guard could damage their own careers. The palace grapevine was merciless in its efficiency, and already Thomas could feel the social isolation that came with being labeled a security risk. In a community built around the royal family, his disgrace made him radioactive. Margaret Chun, his neighbor and one of the few people in the village who worked outside the royal ecosystem, knocked on his door around tea time. She ran the local bakery and had always treated him as simply Thomas, not Sergeant Mitchell of the Royal Guard. Her practical nature and outsider perspective made her one of the few people he trusted to think clearly about his situation. "You look terrible," she said without preamble, pushing past him into the cottage with a bag of fresh scones and a thermos of tea. "The whole village is talking about what happened. Half of them think you've been selling royal secrets, and the other half think you've been framed." Thomas showed her the recording device, explaining how he had found it, and his growing certainty that his dismissal had been orchestrated by someone with access to palace security and intimate knowledge of royal protocols. Margaret examined the device with the careful attention she usually reserved for examining her bread dough for proper consistency. "This is sophisticated equipment," she said finally. "My ex-husband was in electronics before he ran off with his secretary. He used to repair surveillance equipment for security companies. This isn't something you buy at the local electronics shop. Someone with serious resources and technical knowledge planted this on you." The confirmation of his suspicions brought no comfort, only a deeper understanding of how thoroughly he had been manipulated. Someone had studied his routines, identified his vulnerabilities, and crafted a plan specifically designed to destroy his career and remove him from his position. The question that haunted him was why anyone would go to such elaborate lengths to eliminate a simple palace guard. That evening, Thomas walked through the village, noting how conversations stopped when people saw him approaching. The postmaster, who had always greeted him warmly, suddenly found urgent business behind the counter. The publican at the Crown and Anchor, where Thomas had been a regular for years, served his pint with uncomfortable silence instead of the usual friendly banter. In a matter of hours, he had become a pariah in the community that had been his anchor. But not everyone avoided him. As he sat alone at his usual corner table, nursing his beer and trying to make sense of his situation, a woman approached him with the confident stride of someone accustomed to getting what she wanted. She was elegantly dressed in a way that suggested money and education, with short gray hair and intelligent eyes that seemed to catalog every detail of his appearance. "Sergeant Mitchell," she said, settling into the chair across from him without invitation. "My name is Dr. Elizabeth Hartwell. I believe we need to talk." Thomas studied her carefully, his training automatically assessing potential threats even in his civilian status. She carried herself like someone with authority, but there was something in her manner that suggested she was not part of the official machinery that had destroyed his career. Her accent placed her education at Cambridge or Oxford, and her clothes suggested comfortable wealth rather than government salary. "I'm afraid you have me at a disadvantage, Dr. Hartwell," Thomas said carefully. "I'm no longer Sergeant Mitchell, just Thomas, and I'm not sure I'm in the mood for conversation with strangers." She smiled, and there was genuine warmth in the expression that made Thomas want to trust her despite his newfound paranoia about approaching strangers. From her handbag, she produced a business card that identified her as Dr. Elizabeth Hartwell, historical researcher, Royal Archives, and Constitutional Studies, Cambridge University. "I've been investigating irregularities in royal security protocols for the past 18 months, she said quietly, leaning forward so their conversation could not be overheard by other patrons. "Your case is not the first instance of loyal palace staff being removed under questionable circumstances. There have been others, and the pattern suggests something much larger than simple security concerns." Thomas felt his pulse quicken. The possibility that his situation was part of a larger pattern offered both hope for vindication and terror at the implications. If other loyal staff had been systematically removed, then someone was working to compromise royal security from within, which represented a threat to the very institution he had sworn to protect. "What kind of pattern?" he asked, keeping his voice low and his expression neutral in case they were being watched. Dr. Hartwell opened a leather portfolio and showed him photographs of 5 other individuals, all in palace uniforms, all with the bearing of career military or security personnel. She provided brief details about each case: a valet dismissed for alleged theft, a cook fired for supposed food safety violations, a gardener removed for allegedly selling information about royal habits, a driver terminated for presumed security breaches, and a maid discharged for supposed improper conduct. Each case involved accusations that seemed credible on the surface, she explained, but when examined closely, the evidence was either circumstantial or potentially fabricated. Each person dismissed had exemplary service records. Each had access to different aspects of royal security or daily routines. And, in each case, their removal eliminated someone who might have observed or reported unusual activities within palace operations. The implications were staggering. Someone was systematically removing reliable, observant staff members who might interfere with whatever larger plan was unfolding within the royal household. Thomas realized that his dismissal was not personal persecution, but strategic elimination, which somehow made it even more chilling. "Why are you telling me this?" Thomas asked. "And why should I trust that you are who you claim to be?" Dr. Hartwell produced additional identification, including a letter of introduction from Professor Sir William Ashford, whose name Thomas recognized as a respected royal historian and constitutional expert. She also showed him press credentials and academic publications that established her legitimate research interests in royal security and constitutional matters. "Because," she said, "I believe something is being planned that poses a direct threat to the monarchy, and the systematic removal of observant, loyal staff is part of the preparation for that threat. Your military background and security training make you potentially valuable in understanding and preventing whatever is coming." Thomas felt the weight of implications settling on his shoulders like a lead blanket. If Dr. Hartwell was correct, then his personal tragedy was a small part of a much larger conspiracy that threatened the institution he had devoted his life to protecting. The recording device in his pocket suddenly felt like evidence of treason rather than simple career sabotage. "What do you want from me?" he asked. "I want you to help me identify who is behind these dismissals and what they're planning," she said. "Your knowledge of palace security, your understanding of royal routines, and your ability to think like a soldier could provide insights that my academic research cannot." Thomas considered the proposal carefully. Association with Dr. Hartwell's investigation could further destroy his reputation and eliminate any chance of future employment in security or government service. On the other hand, if she was correct about the threat to the monarchy, then his loyalty to the crown demanded action regardless of personal cost. "If I agree to help," he said finally, "I need complete honesty about what you know and what you suspect. I also need assurance that you have legitimate backing for this investigation and that we're not simply chasing conspiracy theories." Dr. Hartwell nodded and spent the next hour providing detailed information about her research, her contacts within the academic and intelligence communities, and her growing certainty that someone was positioning themselves to exploit or create a crisis that would fundamentally damage the monarchy's stability and security. She showed him financial records indicating unusual payments made through shell companies to several former palace employees, suggesting that some of the dismissed staff might have been paid to leave quietly rather than fight their terminations. She also had communication intercepts that suggested coordination between the dismissals and political movements that sought to diminish royal influence in British society. The pattern suggests that someone is systematically weakening palace security and removing loyal observers in preparation for an event that requires compromised protection, she concluded. "Your dismissal removes one of the most experienced and dedicated guards from the king's immediate protection detail at a time when that protection may be crucial." Thomas realized that his personal desire for vindication was far less important than the possibility that King Charles III faced a threat that the remaining palace security might be unable or unwilling to prevent. His oath of loyalty transcended his employment status, and if the crown was in danger, then his duty remained clear regardless of how he had been treated. "What's the next step?" he asked. Dr. Hartwell smiled with satisfaction and relief. "We need to identify who had the access and authority to orchestrate these dismissals. That means understanding who benefits from weakening palace security and who has the resources to execute such a sophisticated operation. It also means recognizing that we're likely up against people with significant power and influence who won't hesitate to eliminate anyone who threatens their plans." As they shook hands to formalize their partnership, Thomas felt a sense of purpose returning for the first time since his dismissal. He was no longer simply a disgraced former guard seeking personal vindication. He was now a soldier engaged in what might be the most important mission of his life, protecting the crown from enemies who had turned his loyalty into a weapon against him. The recording device in his pocket no longer felt like evidence of his failure, but like a clue that might help save the very institution that had cast him out. Thomas Mitchell was going to war again, and this time the battlefield was the ancient stones and hidden corridors of the British monarchy itself. The next morning brought unexpected developments that changed everything Thomas thought he understood about his situation. Dr. Hartwell arrived at his cottage before dawn, her usually composed demeanor replaced by urgent tension that made Thomas immediately alert. She carried a tablet computer and a manila envelope that she handled like it contained explosives. "We've had a breakthrough," she said without preamble, settling at his kitchen table and opening the tablet. "I received this information from a contact within the cabinet office last night. The timing of your dismissal wasn't coincidental. It was specifically orchestrated to coincide with a planned state visit from the German Chancellor next week." Thomas poured coffee with hands that remained steady despite the adrenaline coursing through his system. His military training had taught him to remain calm during briefings, no matter how disturbing the information being presented. Dr. Hartwell's revelation suggested that his removal was tied to a specific event, which meant the threat they were investigating had a timeline and a target. The German Chancellor's visit involved sensitive discussions about European security cooperation and post-Brexit trade relationships, Dr. Hartwell continued, pulling up classified documents on her tablet screen. More importantly, it includes private meetings between King Charles and Chancellor Weber about intelligence sharing agreements that could significantly impact both British and German national security. Thomas studied the information, his experience in palace security allowing him to immediately understand the implications. State visits required carefully coordinated protection protocols, and any weakness in the security apparatus could be exploited by hostile actors seeking to influence or disrupt crucial international negotiations. His dismissal had removed someone intimately familiar with those protocols at precisely the moment when that knowledge would be most valuable to potential enemies. "Who has access to this level of information about the state visit?" Thomas asked, his analytical mind automatically beginning to construct threat assessments. "That's what makes this so concerning," Dr. Hartwell replied, opening the manila envelope to reveal photographs of several individuals. The planning involves multiple government departments, intelligence services, and palace officials. Any one of dozens of people could have the information necessary to plan an operation around the visit. The photographs showed men and women in expensive suits, their faces carrying the confident expressions of people accustomed to wielding significant power. Dr. Hartwell identified each individual: cabinet ministers, senior civil servants, intelligence officials, and palace administrators who formed the inner circle of people responsible for coordinating high-level state functions. However, she continued, our analysis of the dismissed staff members reveals that each person had specific knowledge or access that would be crucial for someone planning to compromise the chancellor's visit. The valet knew the king's personal security habits. The cook understood food service protocols. The gardener was familiar with exterior ground security. And you had comprehensive knowledge of visitor protection procedures. Thomas felt pieces of a complex puzzle beginning to align in his mind. The systematic dismissals weren't random acts of malice. They were strategic moves designed to eliminate specific knowledge and capabilities that might interfere with a carefully planned operation. Someone had studied palace security with the precision of a military strategist and removed the pieces that could threaten their success. There's more, Dr. Hartwell said, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. My contact discovered that several of the dismissed employees have disappeared entirely. They've left their homes, closed bank accounts, and severed all contact with family and friends. People don't simply vanish like that unless they're either dead or have been relocated with new identities. The implication sent ice through Thomas's veins. If former palace staff were being eliminated to prevent them from interfering with whatever was planned, then his own life might be in immediate danger. More importantly, it suggested that the conspiracy involved resources and ruthlessness far beyond simple political maneuvering. We need to contact the authorities immediately, Thomas said, reaching for his phone. This information needs to reach people who can protect the king and the chancellor. Dr. Hartwell caught his wrist with surprising strength. That's exactly what we cannot do, she said firmly. My contact warned me that the operation appears to have support from within the security services themselves. We don't know who can be trusted, and approaching the wrong people could accelerate whatever timeline the conspirators are following. Thomas felt the familiar weight of impossible decisions that had characterized his military service in combat zones. Every option carried risks, and the wrong choice could result in catastrophic consequences. His training told him to follow proper channels and trust the system. But Dr. Hartwell's information suggested that the system itself might be compromised. Then, what do you propose we do? He asked. We need to identify the person coordinating these dismissals, she said, pulling up another document on her tablet. Someone with access to personnel files, security protocols, and the authority to orchestrate terminations across multiple departments. Someone who understands palace operations intimately enough to know exactly which staff members posed threats to their plans. Dr. Hartwell showed him organizational charts that mapped the complex hierarchy of palace administration, government oversight, and security coordination. The number of people with the necessary access and authority was surprisingly small, perhaps a dozen individuals who had both the knowledge and power to orchestrate the systematic staff removals. I've been analyzing communication patterns, travel records, and financial transactions for these key figures, she explained. Most show normal patterns, but 3 individuals have anomalies that suggest coordination with external parties. The 3 suspects were Sir Reginald Worthington, Deputy Private Secretary to the King, Colonel James Blackwood, Assistant Commissioner for Royal Protection, and Lady Catherine Morrison, Director of Palace Administration. Each had impeccable credentials, decades of loyal service, and the complete trust of the royal family. Each also had recent communication patterns and financial activities that deviated from their historical norms. Thomas studied the information with growing certainty that they were looking at the architects of a conspiracy that threatened the very heart of British constitutional democracy. These were not foreign agents or obvious enemies. They were trusted insiders who had used their positions to systematically weaken the defenses they were supposed to strengthen. Sir Worthington has been in contact with representatives of several European corporations that would benefit significantly from changes in post-Brexit trade policies, Dr. Hartwell explained. Colonel Blackwood has received payments through shell companies that trace back to intelligence services of countries that oppose British-German cooperation. Lady Morrison has been coordinating with political groups that advocate for reducing royal influence in government affairs. The pattern suggested a multi-layered conspiracy that combined foreign interference, corporate interests, and domestic political opposition into a coordinated assault on the monarchy's ability to function effectively. The German chancellor's visit represented a perfect opportunity to create a crisis that would simultaneously damage British-German relations, embarrass the royal family, and provide justification for reducing royal involvement in international affairs. They're planning something during the state dinner, Thomas realized, his security training allowing him to visualize the vulnerabilities that would exist during such a high-profile event. Maximum visibility, maximum political impact, and maximum potential for long-term damage to the institution. Dr. Hartwell nodded grimly. Our analysis suggests that they plan to create an incident that will appear to be a security failure caused by inadequate palace protection. The systematic staff removals ensure that the people who might recognize and prevent the operation won't be in position to interfere. Thomas felt the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders like armor. His dismissal had been intended to remove him as an obstacle, but instead it had freed him to act without the constraints of protocol and chain of command. He was no longer bound by palace regulations or government oversight. He was simply a loyal subject with the knowledge and skills necessary to protect his sovereign. "We need to get inside the palace during the state visit," he said, already beginning to formulate a plan. "I know the security protocols, the staff routines, and the physical layout better than almost anyone. If we can identify the specific threat and expose the conspirators in the act, we can prevent whatever they're planning and protect both the king and the chancellor." Dr. Hartwell looked at him with a mixture of admiration and concern. "Thomas, attempting to enter palace grounds would be considered a serious crime given your banned status. If you're caught, you'll be arrested and charged with multiple offenses. Even if we're correct about the conspiracy, your actions could be portrayed as those of a disgruntled former employee seeking revenge." Thomas understood the risks, but he also understood the stakes. The systematic dismantling of palace security, the coordination with foreign and domestic enemies, and the targeting of a crucial state visit suggested an operation designed to fundamentally damage Britain's position in international affairs and the monarchy's role in constitutional government. "My grandfather served King George VI during the Second World War," Thomas said quietly. "He told me stories about the difficult decisions that had to be made when the nation faced existential threats. Sometimes loyalty demands actions that appear treasonous to those who don't understand the true nature of the threat." Dr. Hartwell studied his face for a long moment, recognizing the resolve of someone who had made a decision that transcended personal consequences. "If we're going to do this," she said finally, "we need a plan that maximizes our chances of success while minimizing the risk of being dismissed as conspiracy theorists or criminals." They spent the rest of the day developing a strategy that would allow Thomas to enter the palace during the state visit and position himself to identify and prevent whatever operation the conspirators had planned. The plan was dangerous, likely illegal, and almost certainly career-ending for both of them. It was also, Thomas realized, the only way to protect the crown from enemies who had used the system's own protocols and procedures as weapons against the institution they were supposed to serve. As evening approached, Thomas felt a sense of calm certainty that he had not experienced since his dismissal. He was no longer a victim of circumstances beyond his control. He was a soldier preparing for the most important mission of his life. The recording device that had been used to frame him now sat on his table as evidence of enemy action, and tomorrow he would begin the process of turning their own trap against them. The battle for the crown was about to begin, and Thomas Mitchell was ready to fight. The morning of the German chancellor's state visit dawned crisp and clear, with the kind of perfect weather that made outdoor ceremonies look magnificent on television and gave security teams clear sight lines across the palace grounds. Thomas Mitchell stood in the shadows of St. George's Chapel, watching the elaborate preparations unfold with the trained eye of someone who had coordinated such events countless times before. Today, however, he was not part of the official security apparatus. He was a ghost in the machine, preparing to prevent a disaster that the legitimate authorities didn't even know was coming. Dr. Hartwell had positioned herself among the invited academic observers, her credentials as a royal historian providing perfect cover for her presence at the ceremonial events. Through a series of subtle signals developed during their planning sessions, she would communicate any unusual activities or changes in the official schedule that might indicate the conspiracy was accelerating their timeline. Thomas wore the dark suit and bearing of a palace security consultant, a cover identity that Dr. Hartwell's contacts had created with documentation sophisticated enough to pass casual inspection. His intimate knowledge of palace routines and security protocols allowed him to move through the controlled chaos of preparation with confidence, appearing to belong even to people who might have recognized his face under different circumstances. The first sign that their suspicions were correct came during the mid-morning security briefing. Thomas positioned himself where he could observe the meeting through a partially open doorway, using skills learned during reconnaissance operations in Afghanistan. Colonel Blackwood was presenting the final security arrangements to the senior staff, but his presentation included several modifications to standard protocols that made Thomas's blood run cold. Due to ongoing construction in the East Wing, Colonel Blackwood explained to the assembled security chiefs, "We've relocated the Chancellor's private meeting with His Majesty to the library, with modified access routes that bypass the usual checkpoint procedures." Thomas knew immediately that this was a lie. There was no construction in the East Wing, and the library was one of the most difficult locations in the palace to secure properly. Its multiple entrances, large windows, and proximity to public tour routes made it a security nightmare that would never be chosen for a sensitive diplomatic meeting unless someone wanted to create vulnerabilities that could be exploited. Even more concerning was Blackwood's announcement that several senior guards had been reassigned to perimeter duties, leaving the Chancellor's close protection to a skeleton crew of personnel that Thomas didn't recognize. These were not the experienced professionals who normally handled such high-stakes assignments. They appeared to be newer staff whose loyalty and competence were unknown quantities. Through careful observation and movement that appeared routine to anyone watching, Thomas began mapping the actual security deployment against what Blackwood had announced. The discrepancies were systematic and alarming. Key choke points were understaffed, surveillance cameras had been repositioned to create blind spots, and the emergency response protocols had been modified in ways that would slow reaction times during a crisis. Dr. Hartwell's first signal came during the formal welcoming ceremony on the palace forecourt. She touched her left earring twice, indicating that she had observed Lady Morrison directing staff members away from the library area under the pretense of preparing for an unscheduled photographic session. This was clearly designed to clear potential witnesses from the area where the private meeting would take place. Thomas used the cover of the ceremony's controlled chaos to position himself with a clear view of the library's approaches. What he saw confirmed his worst fears about the operation's scope and sophistication. Sir Worthington was coordinating the placement of unfamiliar staff members at critical security positions, while Lady Morrison ensured that loyal, experienced personnel were occupied with tasks that kept them away from the sensitive areas. The conspiracy was unfolding with military precision, using the legitimate security apparatus as cover for an operation designed to compromise the private meeting between King Charles and Chancellor Weber. Thomas realized that the conspirators weren't planning a direct assault or obvious attack. They were creating conditions that would allow them to record, manipulate, or disrupt sensitive diplomatic discussions in ways that could be used to damage both leaders politically. As the official ceremonies moved toward the scheduled private meeting, Thomas knew that he had to act despite the enormous risks involved. His communication with Dr. Hartwell was limited to their prearranged signals, and any attempt to alert the legitimate security forces would likely result in his immediate arrest before he could explain the true nature of the threat. He made his decision based on 12 years of experience protecting the royal family and a lifetime of understanding that loyalty sometimes demanded actions that appeared treasonous to those who didn't understand the true situation. Moving with the confidence of someone who belonged in the restricted areas, Thomas began making his way toward the library through service corridors that he knew were temporarily unmanned due to Blackwood's security modifications. The first obstacle came in the form of two unfamiliar guards who were positioned at a junction that should have been empty according to the official security plan. Their placement suggested that they were specifically watching for unauthorized personnel, or perhaps for Thomas specifically, if the conspirators had anticipated that he might attempt to interfere with their operation. Thomas approached them with the bearing of a senior security official conducting a routine inspection. "Gentlemen," he said with the authority that had made him effective as a sergeant, "I need to verify the sight lines from this position to the library approaches. Has Colonel Blackwood briefed you on the modified protocols for the Chancellor's arrival?" The guards exchanged glances that revealed they were not completely briefed on all aspects of the operation they were supporting. This suggested that the conspiracy was compartmentalized, with most participants knowing only their specific roles rather than understanding the larger plan they were facilitating. "Sir," one of them replied, We were told to monitor this corridor and report any unusual activity. We weren't given specific information about protocol modifications. Thomas nodded as if this was exactly what he had expected to hear. Excellent. That's precisely the level of operational security we need for this type of diplomatic meeting. Carry on with your assignments. And remember that any deviation from your orders could compromise international relations at the highest level. The guards straightened with the pride of men who believed they were serving an important purpose, allowing Thomas to continue toward the library with their unwitting cooperation. The exchange had also provided valuable intelligence about the conspiracy structure. The operational staff were following orders without understanding their true purpose, which meant the real decision-makers were a small group who could maintain control while using the legitimate security apparatus as cover. Thomas reached a service alcove near the library just as King Charles and Chancellor Weber were arriving for their private meeting. Through a maintenance panel that provided access to the building's communication infrastructure, he could observe the main entrance while remaining hidden from both the official security team and any potential threats that might be approaching the area. What he saw in the next few minutes confirmed every suspicion that he and Dr. Hartwell had developed about the conspiracy's objectives. Sir Worthington appeared in the corridor outside the library, carrying what appeared to be a standard briefcase, but moving with the careful precision of someone handling sensitive electronic equipment. Lady Morrison emerged from a side passage, nodding to Worthington in a way that suggested coordination of a complex operation. Most damning of all was Colonel Blackwood's arrival with a small team of the unfamiliar personnel Thomas had observed earlier. Instead of maintaining security positions outside the meeting room, they were clearly preparing to enter the library itself, which violated every protocol that governed such sensitive diplomatic discussions. Thomas realized that the conspiracy was not planning to disrupt the meeting. They were planning to record it using sophisticated surveillance equipment that would capture every word of the private discussions between the king and the chancellor. The systematic staff dismissals had eliminated the experienced personnel who would have immediately recognized such a massive security breach, while the modified protocols provided cover for placing recording equipment and personnel in positions where they could compromise the meeting without being detected by normal security measures. The implications were staggering. Private diplomatic discussions between heads of state often involved sensitive intelligence, strategic assessments, and candid evaluations of international relationships that could be devastating if leaked or manipulated. Recording such conversations would provide leverage that could be used to influence or blackmail both leaders, while selective leaks could be used to damage public confidence in the monarchy and disrupt crucial international alliances. Thomas checked his watch and realized that he had perhaps 5 minutes before the conspirators implemented whatever plan they had developed. His options were limited and all involved significant risks, but his oath of loyalty to the crown demanded action regardless of personal consequences. He could attempt to physically confront the conspirators, try to alert the king directly, or create a distraction that might disrupt their operation without revealing his own presence. The choice was made for him when he observed Worthington opening his briefcase and beginning to assemble what was clearly sophisticated recording equipment. There was no more time for careful planning or risk assessment. Thomas had to act immediately or watch the monarchy become vulnerable to blackmail and manipulation by enemies who had used their trusted positions as weapons against the institution they had sworn to protect. As Thomas prepared to emerge from his hiding place and confront the conspirators, he reflected on the irony of his situation. He had been dismissed as a security risk and banned from palace grounds, but now he was the only person in position to prevent a threat that could fundamentally damage the crown's ability to function as an independent institution. His disgrace had become the key to his sovereign's protection, and his loyalty had survived the system's betrayal. The battle for the monarchy was about to begin, and Thomas Mitchell was ready to fight the most important engagement of his life. Thomas emerged from the service alcove with the controlled aggression of a soldier who had made peace with the possibility of dying in service to something larger than himself. The corridor outside the library stretched before him like a battlefield where the future of the British monarchy would be determined in the next few critical minutes. Sir Worthington was bent over his briefcase, assembling recording equipment with the focused concentration of someone performing a well-rehearsed operation, while Colonel Blackwood positioned his team of unfamiliar personnel at strategic points that would allow them to control access to the meeting room. "Sir Reginald," Thomas called out, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had every right to be in that corridor. I need to speak with you immediately about a security concern that affects the Chancellor's safety." Worthington spun around with the startled expression of someone caught in an act they knew was wrong, while Blackwood's hand moved instinctively toward his sidearm before he recognized Thomas's face. The moment of shocked recognition that passed between the conspirators told Thomas everything he needed to know about their guilty knowledge and their understanding of why he represented a threat to their operation. "Sergeant Mitchell," Blackwood said, his voice tight with barely controlled tension. "You are banned from these premises and subject to immediate arrest for trespassing on royal property. I'm ordering you to leave immediately or face criminal prosecution." Thomas stepped closer, positioning himself so that he could observe both men while keeping the library entrance within his peripheral vision. His military training had taught him to assess multiple threats simultaneously, and he could see that Worthington was attempting to conceal the recording equipment while Blackwood was calculating whether to escalate the confrontation into physical violence. "I think we both know that my presence here has nothing to do with trespassing and everything to do with preventing treason," Thomas replied, his voice calm despite the adrenaline coursing through his system. "The question is whether you're going to continue with an operation that compromises His Majesty's security, or whether you're going to explain why you've been systematically eliminating loyal staff members in preparation for recording private diplomatic conversations." The accusation hit its target with devastating accuracy. Worthington's face went pale with the realization that their carefully planned operation had been discovered and understood, while Blackwood's expression shifted from authority to calculation as he weighed his options for dealing with an unexpected threat to the conspiracy. "You're delusional," Blackwood said, but his voice lacked conviction. "You're a disgraced former employee who violated security protocols and lost his position due to his own failures. Any accusations you make will be dismissed as the fantasies of someone seeking revenge against the institution that rightfully rejected him." Thomas had anticipated this line of defense and was prepared with evidence that would be impossible to dismiss or explain away. From his jacket, he produced the recording device that had been planted in his uniform, along with photographs and documentation that Dr. Hartwell had assembled about the systematic staff dismissals and the financial irregularities that connected the conspirators to foreign and domestic enemies of the crown. "This recording device was planted in my uniform to provide justification for my dismissal," Thomas said, holding the equipment where both men could see it clearly. "But it also contains fingerprints and technical specifications that will lead investigators directly to the people who supplied it, just as the financial records will show payments made to ensure that loyal staff members were removed from positions where they might interfere with operations like the one you're conducting today." Sir Worthington looked at the evidence with the expression of someone watching his entire future collapse in real time. The recording equipment in his briefcase was sophisticated enough to capture diplomatic conversations with clarity that would make them valuable for blackmail or intelligence purposes, but it was also traceable to sources that would expose the international nature of the conspiracy he had joined. "You don't understand the larger situation," Worthington said, his voice taking on the desperate tone of someone attempting to justify actions he knew were wrong. "The monarchy's involvement in international affairs has become a liability that threatens British interests. These discussions with foreign leaders create commitments and obligations that limit our government's flexibility in dealing with European relationships." Thomas felt a mixture of disgust and pity for a man who had rationalized betraying everything he had sworn to protect. "So you decided to betray your oath, compromise your sovereign, and collaborate with foreign intelligence services because you disagreed with constitutional arrangements that have served this nation for centuries." The sound of approaching footsteps in the corridor made all three men freeze as they realized that their confrontation was about to be interrupted by the arrival of additional personnel. Thomas hoped it would be loyal palace security who could take control of the situation and prevent the recording operation from proceeding. Instead, Lady Morrison appeared with two more of the unfamiliar staff members, clearly intending to provide additional support for the conspiracy's implementation. "Colonel Blackwood," Lady Morrison said before she noticed Thomas's presence, "the King and Chancellor have begun their meeting. We need to activate the recording equipment immediately if we're going to capture the discussions about intelligence sharing protocols." The statement was a complete confession that confirmed everything Thomas had suspected about the conspiracy's objectives and methods. Lady Morrison's face went white as she realized that she had just admitted to treason in the presence of someone who could expose the entire operation to legitimate authorities. Thomas knew that he was now facing 5 conspirators in a confined space, with no backup and no way to summon assistance without alerting them to his intentions. "I'm sorry it has come to this," he said with what appeared to be genuine regret. "But you forced us into a position where we have to protect an operation that serves the greater good of British interests." Thomas understood that he was facing people who had convinced themselves that their betrayal was actually patriotic service, which made them far more dangerous than simple criminals motivated by personal gain. They believed their cause justified any actions necessary to achieve their objectives, including murder if required to protect their operation. "If you kill me," Thomas said calmly, "you'll create exactly the kind of security incident that will bring enormous scrutiny to everything that happens here today. My death will raise questions that will lead investigators directly to your operation and everyone involved in it." Dr. Hartwell's voice suddenly echoed from the main corridor as she approached with what sounded like a group of official personnel. "The security breach has been confirmed," she was saying in a voice loud enough to be heard clearly by everyone in the area. "Palace security has been notified, and additional personnel are being deployed to secure all sensitive areas immediately." Thomas realized that Dr. Hartwell was creating a diversion that would force the conspirators to either abort their operation or escalate into violence that would expose them to immediate discovery. Her academic credentials had apparently provided her with access to legitimate palace officials who could respond to reports of security concerns with appropriate urgency and authority. Colonel Blackwood's calculation changed instantly as he realized that their carefully planned operation was about to be interrupted by legitimate security personnel who would immediately recognize the unauthorized recording equipment and the presence of personnel who had no business in the restricted area. The choice was between aborting the operation and maintaining their cover, or escalating into open violence that would expose the conspiracy, but eliminate the witnesses who could testify about their activities. "Stand down, Colonel," Thomas said with the authority of someone who understood military hierarchy and the weight of oath-bound loyalty. "You still have a choice between serving the crown you swore to protect and continuing down a path that ends with you facing charges of high treason." The moment stretched into eternity as Blackwood weighed his options while the sound of approaching footsteps grew louder. Sir Worthington was hastily disassembling the recording equipment, while Lady Morrison looked ready to flee rather than face the consequences of her actions. The unfamiliar staff members appeared confused and uncertain, clearly unprepared for a situation that deviated from their expected assignments. The resolution came when Captain Reynolds, Thomas's former commanding officer, appeared in the corridor with a team of legitimate palace security personnel who immediately assessed the situation with professional competence. The presence of unauthorized recording equipment, unfamiliar personnel in restricted areas, and an armed confrontation involving banned individuals created exactly the kind of security alert that palace protocols were designed to handle with swift and decisive action. "Colonel Blackwood," Captain Reynolds said with the cold authority of someone whose loyalty had never been compromised, "you will immediately surrender your weapon and submit to security review. Sir Worthington and Lady Morrison, you are confined to quarters pending investigation of activities that appear to violate your oaths of service to the crown." Thomas felt the weight of vindication and relief as he realized that the conspiracy had been exposed and prevented before it could achieve its objectives. The recording operation that would have compromised private diplomatic discussions had been stopped, and the systematic betrayal that had destroyed his career was finally being recognized by people with the authority to address it appropriately. King Charles appeared in the library doorway, drawn by the commotion in the corridor outside his meeting with the German Chancellor. His expression showed the mixture of confusion and concern appropriate for a sovereign who had just discovered that trusted advisors had been plotting against the institution he embodied. "Your Majesty," Thomas said, standing at attention despite his civilian clothes and unofficial status, "the security breach has been contained, and the threat to your private discussions with Chancellor Weber has been eliminated." The king studied Thomas's face for a long moment, recognition dawning as he remembered the loyal guard who had been dismissed for alleged security violations just days earlier. The irony of the situation was evident to everyone present. The man who had been branded a security risk had just prevented a genuine threat to the crown's ability to conduct confidential diplomatic business. "Sergeant Mitchell," the king said quietly, "it appears that this institution owes you both an apology and a debt of gratitude that will be difficult to repay appropriately." Thomas felt tears threatening at the edges of his vision as he realized that his loyalty had been vindicated and his service recognized by the sovereign he had never stopped protecting, even when that protection required acting outside the system that had betrayed him. The recording device that had been used to destroy his career would now serve as evidence to prosecute the people who had turned the palace's own security protocols into weapons against the institution they were designed to protect. Dr. Hartwell emerged from behind Captain Reynolds with the satisfied expression of someone whose academic research had prevented a constitutional crisis. Her investigation had not only exposed the conspiracy but had also provided the evidence necessary to ensure that the conspirators would face appropriate justice for their betrayal of oath and crown. As the conspirators were led away in custody and the recording equipment was secured as evidence, Thomas realized that his disgrace had been transformed into the greatest service of his career. His dismissal had freed him to act without the constraints that might have prevented a loyal insider from recognizing and responding to the threat posed by other insiders who had turned their trusted positions into instruments of betrayal. The German Chancellor's state visit continued without the disruption that had been planned by enemies of both nations, and the private discussions that had been targeted for compromise proceeded with the confidentiality that such sensitive diplomatic conversations required. Thomas Mitchell had saved not just the monarchy, but the integrity of international relationships that affected the security and prosperity of millions of people. Standing in the corridor where he had confronted treason and emerged victorious, Thomas understood that loyalty sometimes demanded sacrifices that appeared to destroy the very thing being protected. His career had been shattered and his reputation destroyed, but the crown remained secure and the institution of monarchy continued to serve the constitutional role that had sustained British democracy for centuries. The king's recognition of his service provided vindication that transcended personal satisfaction. It confirmed that loyalty transcends employment, that duty survives betrayal, and that sometimes the greatest service to crown and country requires acting against the very system that claims to embody those sacred principles. Thomas Mitchell had lost his position as a royal guard, but he had earned something far more valuable, the knowledge that when his sovereign faced genuine peril, he had answered the call of duty regardless of personal cost.